Thanks so much for having me. I actually started AI safety at FAR Labs like 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, and Simplex didn't even exist. So in like many ways, the work you'll see here and all of the stuff built off of the initial stuff, all of that initial work was here, like in various rooms here. So it's pretty cool to be back to show everyone what's going on now at Simplex. So at Simplex, we are focused on building a science of interpretability and really a science of intelligence more generally. And so what that means to us is something more than just kind of like understanding how evals work or trying to figure out how this particular behavior works in terms of internal structure, but really coming up with kind of a general science that's rigorous and principled and that will undergird even our understanding of how to kind of phrase these questions and what an understanding even means. Okay, so kind of the roadmap for the talk will be, I'll give a few words kind of positioning kind of Simplex within the AI safety and interpretability communities. Then the bulk of the talk will be kind of on 3 stories that have come out of our lab. The first one, that transformers represent beliefs over the hidden structure of the generator of the data for the training data. The second one, kind of about the general class over which these beliefs occur. So this is like really talking about the native ontology to transformers and neural networks more generally. And third, a story and an understanding about how transformers break up their representations and their kind of latent understanding of the structure of the world into distinct parts. Then I'll end with like some an eye towards the future, signs of life, kind of at scale in LLMs. And then we'll conclude. Okay, so we're really kind of motivated by a few things. The first is a quite practical concern. What understanding of internal structure would allow us to trust AI behavior? And by this, I think importantly, we don't mean like kind of either vibes, and we don't mean kind of evals. We really do believe we're dealing with like a type of intelligence, and we take that seriously. And that means that someone should be trying at least to kind of deeply understand the ways in which the internal structure of these models relate to their behavior and the training data and the implications of that. So we think this is kind of all within the domain of interpretability. And so what does interpretability look like in practice? Well, like a canonical example comes over the course of the last few years. You start from like a theoretical idea about the nature of features and representations in these neural networks. So that's like the toy models of superposition work or other kind of related work from Lee Sharkey's group a few years back, where you kind of make an assumption about the structure of these features and the representations, where features are linear, whatever features are, they're linear. They're trying to be squished into this small residual stream. They kind of want to be orthogonal, and kind of the math plays out with superposition. Then based on that like highly theoretical understanding, you build tools that respect those theoretical assumptions. So that's SAEs in this case. And then you apply them at scale as much as you can to figure out real things about real models. So that's a tool plus some engineering at the end, and then you try to apply them. And you can apply them kind of either in kind of a more researchy scientific way, like in this on the biology of large language models work from Anthropic, or you can have it more targeted to kind of downstream tasks. Either way, you are kind of applying the tools of interpretability at scale to say real things about real models. So I think it's not that controversial to say that most of the work going on in this domain is kind of on the right-hand side of this plot, in trying to apply and change the tools, whereas kind of these more theoretical concerns were something for like 2 years ago, more or less. But I do want to, from our perspective, there's kind of a gap here. And that is to take a step back and to ask, what are these things that we're looking at? What are these LLMs? What's the nature of their internal structure? How should we think about it? This matters a lot because if you are relying on your tools to build some kind of safety case, or even just an understanding of these systems, and the theoretical assumption on which these tools are built on is either wrong or approximate in ways that you don't understand, you're kind of building in a type of deception into the tool itself. So we really want to kind of have a theoretical foundation that we can trust and that kind of respects the nature of these systems as they are, not as how we want them to be. And we can kind of frame this in two different ways. There's a concern. We're deploying AI systems at scale that we don't understand, and without kind of a scientific understanding of the internals, we can't ground our trust in interpretability methods. But there's also an opportunity, which I think people don't talk about enough, which is that for the first time we have these artificial model organisms of intelligence. And this is an important opportunity to build a real science about how minds work in general. And this is not a claim saying that LLM internals are brain internals. I'm like quite averse to that kind of thing. But I do think that there's a thing missing both in interpretability and in neuroscience, which is that we don't even know how to ask the questions. We don't know the language with which to ask the questions fundamentally about how the kind of distributed computation in a neural network relates to its behavior. And so we don't think these things are in tension. We really do kind of argue that understanding intelligence is safety from this perspective. And that a few things. There's more low-hanging fruit at the theory end, like the work didn't end or shouldn't end at toy models of superposition. With a better kind of theoretical understanding, we can build better tools and learn more and more true real things about real models. But that also we can build a new science of intelligence, both artificial and biological. Okay, so what does interpretability look like at Simplex? Well, in this talk, I'll kind of focus on more of the left-hand side of this, the theoretical aspects moving forward. We're like kind of now at an inflection point where we feel like we've built up enough of the theoretical undergirding to start to kind of move to the right. But I'll focus kind of on the left-hand side for this talk. So let's start all the way on the left. Here I'll present kind of a theoretical idea about the nature of features and representations in neural nets. So we're going to take a step back. We're going to ask, what computational structures are we building into neural networks when we pre-train them on next token prediction? So there's a bunch of kind of ideas that people have and that people argue about. They're not crazy formal. They're in some sense like vibes and kind of gut feelings. But one of the popular ones comes from Ilya Sutskever, which is that to predict the next token well means that you understand the underlying reality that led to the creation of that token. Of course, many of these words, it's not obvious what these actually kind of mean concretely. And so what we'll argue for here and show kind of works theoretically is that we can kind of ground this and concretize it in the following. Predicting the next token well means that you perform Bayesian updating over the latent states of a generative model as you observe more tokens in context. To make this kind of an empirical science alongside the theory, we'll use HMMs in this work as an example of a latent data generating structure. And then we'll make theoretical predictions about the internal structures in neural networks trained on that data. How does this work? Here's a hidden Markov model. Basically, the story is, just as a very simple example, you have these hidden states which the neural network never sees. This is going to be a little machine that generates training data that the transformer is going to be trained on. And we're going to ask the question, theoretically, what do we expect the transformer to kind of learn internally? And so the way that this works is that if you're in this state, you output a 0 with 100% probability. If you're in this state, you output a 1 with 100% probability. And there's two arrows coming out of this one, each with 50-50. And so you flip a coin and you generate a 0 or 1. And so the data that you get out of this is 0, 1 random, 0, 1 random bit, et cetera, et cetera. And importantly, you don't know which of these three states you're necessarily starting. There's a bunch of linear algebra that can very simply describe this system. Just to point out that, again, the transformer does not see anything about kind of the latent S0, SR, and S1. Right, they only get these 0 and 1 tokens. Okay, so let's say that I'm going to give you something that the transformer doesn't even have. I'm going to tell you that this three-state hidden Markov model is the data generator for this process. And then you're going to be doing the next token prediction task. So you go to sleep, you wake up, and I tell you this thing outputted a 0. what are you going to predict for the next token? Well, you know the data generator. Given that it outputted a 0, you know that it could not have taken this transition from S1 to SR. So the best you can do is just have some kind of probability distribution over the remaining 2 states. In this case, it'll be a third, 2/3. And given that a third, 2/3, and given that you know the data generating structure, you can figure out the optimal next token prediction distribution. Now let's say you see a 1. Well, there's only a few paths that can give you 0, 1, and you can do kind of normal Bayesian updating over that. The thing to notice here is that the process that you're going through kind of mentally in order to update your beliefs, in order to figure out the optimal next tokens, is itself another hidden Markov model, except now it's this kind of meta dynamic where the hidden states are your beliefs. And then you see a next token and you update your belief. And that has some structure. In this case, this is what it looks like. After you see a bunch of tokens, you will get to a recurrent part that's isomorphic with the original thing. That's like you've synchronized, you've seen enough tokens such that you know exactly where you are. This doesn't in general happen. This is just true of this case. But this kind of structure is the computational structure that one has to go through for prediction. Notice that this thing is more complicated than that. There's a lesson for you that predicting is in general, more complicated task than generating. And this is what, of course, we're asking LLMs to do during pre-training. Okay, how do we turn this into a prediction about the internal structure of these neural networks? Well, each of these hidden states, that were the beliefs with which you update your kind of internal state in order to do the next token prediction, is a probability distribution. It's 3 numbers that sum to 1. And so they live in, if you plot them on XYZ, they live in a triangle. If you look at it from the front, it's just this simplex. And you can embed each of these states in this simplex. And that gives you a certain geometric arrangement of these points. Why this particular geometric arrangement? Well, if you go through the linear algebra, you actually find that there's kind of a deep truth underneath this, which is that you're embedding different contexts, different sequences of tokens into this simplex. And the rule for how they get embedded is basically that 2 sequences that constrain the future token sequence, not just the next token, but actually the infinite future token sequences, they arrange themselves such that distances kind of preserve closeness in this future distribution. So really what's going on here, you can think of this in 2 ways. Either you're kind of have a geometric structure that has to do with your beliefs over a latent generator, but that's actually equivalent to a geometric structure just given by the way that context constrain future token sequences. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take synthetic generators of this form. We're going to train transformers on them, very standard transformers. We're going to use that geometric arrangement of belief states as a hypothesis for what the internal structure is. And then we're going to try to find if that's linearly decodable from the residual stream. And these are the results. So we're using a slightly different HMM here to make the prediction a little less obvious. Like this is like a pretty crazy prediction that you train on this 3-state HMM. Maybe the obvious thing, even if you thought Ilya Sutskever's thing was right, was that, oh, you understand that there's a 3-state HMM. So like maybe you represent the states and maybe you represent the transition matrices. But actually, if you just do the theory out, you get this like pretty awesome fractal in this particular case. And what's more is you can find it in the residual stream. And you can do that through linear regression. It turns out, actually, if you just do PCA on the residual stream, it's also there in the first 3 PCs. And then importantly, the theory actually makes another interesting prediction, which is that the states that are represented in the transformer have to do not just with next token prediction, but with prediction over long futures. And even states that have similar next token predictions will distinguish themselves in the residual stream, which is maybe unintuitive because, of course, pre-training is just about next token prediction in some sense. And so what we have here is a 5-state generator where most of the states actually give you the same next token distribution, and yet we find that, according to the theory, And in reality, you get these kind of distinctions in the points. So that's all very cool. We have like kind of at least the beginning of a way to relate the structure of training data to internal structure and the way that the kind of activations arrange themselves inside. Okay, so you might be an interpretability researcher, and then we come and we tell you this thing. Predicting the next token well means that you perform Bayesian updating over this world model. And you're like, okay, but like, I don't know, you used HMMs. Surely things are more general than HMMs. Like, this doesn't seem all that relevant. Like, are you talking about Boolean circuits in general, or Turing machines, or quantum computing, LOL? Well, actually, it turns out the more general story is kind of like quantum computing, but actually much more general than that. So again, you're an interpretability researcher. Actually, I think those slides were flipped. In any case. So what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of dig deeper into the theory to come up with a more general form that kind of respects the native ontology, or so we claim, of these systems. Okay, so we're going to take a step back and we're going to ask another very general question. What is computation exactly? And so like if you think of what a computational device is, there's really kind of three things to it. There are kind of internal computational states. So for instance, your calculator we could think of as a computational device. It has these internal states given by like the transistor states or something equivalent. They're discrete, right? And these computational states change as you put in and type numbers, right? You change from discrete state to discrete state. And then in addition, there's this map from the internal states, the internal memory states of the system to outputs, right? What you see on the screen. And those are kind of the three things for a computational device. A calculator is like kind of an intuitive one for that. Well, actually, we have that in this example that we had from before. You have a bunch of internal states. These are the memory states that you need to keep track of in order to do next token prediction. There's some dynamics between them, given by the arrows and the probabilities over them. And these arrows have outputs, right? Zeros and ones from them. And we got this triangle that everything is in. And this triangle is there because the memory states are in some sense orthogonal, right, of the generator. So you have these three states. It's like the generator is either in the first state or the second state or the third state. It's not really in between, even though your beliefs about them can be in between. And this is what gives you the triangle. But triangles are very weird. A weird thing to say that everything should be in an actual LLM, because it's effectively a real vectored space in the residual stream. And so is there a more general story here where we kind of still get this intuitive picture of what computational states are, but more clearly respects the actual structure in these LLMs? So what we're going to do is we're going to take this picture for hidden Markov models, and we're going to get rid of everything except for the rule that says there's a way to go from the structure of these computational devices to sequences of tokens. So we're just going to keep the part that says your device must create sequences of tokens and then see what's left over in that structure. And basically what you get is that in the case of HMMs, where you have these kind of discrete states of the generator, which correspond, by the way, to kind of classical computers, where your transistor is like either a 0 or a 1 and not really in between. That gave rise to these simplices. But in general, there are these kind of larger class of generalized probabilistic theories where the states of the generator can lie in a continuum. And your kind of belief states lie in the convex hull of those. As a special case, it ends up being the case that quantum computation is a special case of this framework. But again, the generalized probabilistic theories include systems that are post-quantum in some sense. It's a more general class. Okay, so what does belief updating over these generalized probabilistic theories look like? Well, instead of getting generically fractal structures in simplices, you get them in kind of arbitrary convex shapes. Here's one example of such a process that outputs A, B, C's, and D's. And you end up getting beliefs that lie in a circle with this structure. It turns out that if you try to generate this sequence with an HMM or a classical computational device, it would require infinite memory. But here you get away with just 2 dimensions. And really you're taking advantage of kind of the non-orthogonality, right? You're able to put the states of the generator kind of in a continuum, and because of that, you can save an enormous amount of space. Okay, so we can train a transformer on this synthetic data generator, and indeed, over training, you get that it learns this structure, and it does so in a low, in like 2 or 3 dimensions in the residual stream. Okay, so the story here is that we're getting to kind of the most general picture we can come up with that actually tells us the type of structures that these models will learn internally, given that you are training on sequences of tokens. Like that's kind of the story here. In this particular case, the lessons we get from this paper, like neural networks utilize this non-orthogonality in like a pretty deep way. And they transcend the classical paradigm of computation. And we're not claiming that they're quantum computers. That's not the point. The point is that they use this non-orthogonality in an analogous way to quantum computation works, which is to say that they are able to embed states in a continuum, pure states. So, and this matters kind of for a bunch of implicit ways. Like, I think often we think of interpretability as being about circuits and features that are like kind of on or off, right? You're like either a cat or a dog and kind of not really anything in between. This gives a very different picture. It also kind of, by the way, gives you for free a picture of low D subspaces or manifolds in which you get like kind of very interesting geometric structure instead of like 1D things. If you want to read more about that, there's the paper. This is also, importantly, like not that much about specifically the transformer was taken into account in making any of this theory, right? So like the important things, again, were just about doing prediction over sequences of tokens. And so you can also apply this to RNNs and LSTMs and GRU networks. As long as they're doing kind of a next token prediction task, these results hold. Okay, but we are, of course, interested in actual LLMs. The point is not to do like toy theory work. So can this actually work in practice? First of all, if you try to think of the minimal generator, even if it's this kind of post-quantum thing, the minimal generator for like all of the data on the internet is still going to be crazy enormous, much, much bigger than the residual stream, basically no matter how big you make your model. Also, every different task is kind of all mixed together into one complicated, huge belief geometry, which just kind of intuitively doesn't sit well. And this relates to kind of a long-standing dream of at least one flavor of interpretability, which is to decompose the activations into distinct interpretable parts. Like, does our theory say that's not actually possible because everything is just in this one crazy belief geometry? So our newest work, which we released just a few weeks ago, an archive, Transformers Learn Factored Representation, speaks directly to this. So what happens if the data generator is made of parts? Well, let's consider this 4-state hidden Markov model. It has 4 hidden states. It outputs A's, B's, C's, and D's. You get some data out of it. It turns out that in this particular case, this isn't going to be true of every 4-state hidden Markov model. But in this particular case, the transition probabilities and the structure works out such that you can really kind of interpret each of these hidden states as the product of two states, 2 latent states. So it's as if this hidden Markov model, which just generates zeros and ones, is running in parallel to this one that just generates zeros and ones. And then you have like some encoding scheme for the A, B, C's, and D's, where 1, 0 might be C, and 1, 1 is D, and so on and so forth. And so you can understand, this is like an alternative representation, which kind of is the factorization or the decomposition of that big one. What does our story say in this particular case? Well, for the left-hand side, like kind of the true generator in some sense, or the joint one, because it's a 4D system, you get beliefs in 3 dimensions, basically in a tetrahedron. In general, it will kind of be, these belief states will be kind of arbitrarily spread out in the tetrahedron. But it turns out that if you kind of have this independent factorization, that they all must lie on a submanifold that's curved within that joint space. The math is in the paper. But if you kind of understood the world to be in parts, you could represent beliefs over each of these things independently. And then this is 2D, so the beliefs are a one-dimensional simplex. This is 2D, so you have another one-dimensional simplex. And then there's a one-to-one mapping between beliefs here and beliefs kind of in this space. This one is 3D. It's nonlinear. It's curved. This one is 2D in this case. And the more parts you have, the more this difference in dimensionality is between these two things. But of course, if you're a transformer, you only see A's, B's, C's, and D's. So it's like quite a, it feels at least, improbable thing for the transformer to kind of like figure out kind of magically that an A is really two things put together, and you can kind of understand them as separate things. But you do get two different candidates for representations, right? One, again, is in this joint space that lives on this nonlinear submanifold of the belief space, as long as the parts are independent or conditionally independent, technically. And then secondly, you have this factored representation where each part gets its own orthogonal subspace. Importantly, if this four-state hidden Markov model was such that a true factorization was not like literally possible, then beliefs kind of go off of that submanifold. And when you try to do the factorization, you necessarily get a lossy representation. So if you try to do next token prediction from this factored version, in this case, you will not get perfect prediction. So this gives us what we call a factored world hypothesis, which is that transformers have an inductive bias towards the factored representation, and they organize their activations into a bunch of low-dimensional orthogonal subspaces, each one of them capturing the beliefs over the parts of the generative structure. And what's more, and this is kind of a stronger claim, we even hypothesize that transformers have a bias towards that. In other words, even in cases where the factorization does not give you optimal prediction, there will be a sense in which these transformers actually do represent the factored thing. They will incur the loss just to have less dimensionality. Okay, so what's the experiment we do here? That was like a bunch of theory, but what's the actual experiment? What we're going to do is we're going to train on 5 conditionally independent processes. What does conditionally independent mean? So these are kind of the 3-state HMMs from before, the first 3 parts, and then 2 of the quantum ones. Each of them is kind of 2-dimensional in their beliefs, and each of them outputs a token sequence of 0s, 1s, and 2s, or 0s, 1s, 2s, and 3s. And then what we're going to do, so we're going to generate outputs. Oh, one more thing. So actually, I said conditionally independent, not strictly independent. So to stay on that manifold and to be perfectly factorizable is actually more general than just strictly independent. You can actually have the parts interact. So in other words, the internal dynamics of the memory states of this second factor depend on the output of this one. So the parts of the world can kind of interact, but as long as they interact in a particular conditionally independent way, then you can still kind of factor losslessly. So that's what's going on here. So each of the parts of the world will generate subtokens. So we get 5 subtokens at each context position, and then we kind of map each unique sequence of subtokens to a bigger token. So there's going to be some huge vocab size that's in the many hundreds in this case. And we're going to see what happens in the internal representation. And of course, like one of the main things that the theory says is that the dimensionality of the representation should be very, very different in these 2 cases. So here we're kind of looking at the end of training. If we look at the kind of the dimensionality through kind of a PCA, cumulative explained variance analysis, the ground truth gives you, for the joint representation where you don't factorize, gives you this curve where you take up a lot of space, like something like 130 dimensions in this case, whereas the factored one kind of goes down to like 10-ish dimensions. And what you find over training, going from here to here, is that you actually see that the activations first kind of collapse to like 2 dimensions and then build up towards 10. And you can actually look in the residual stream and you can find linear representations of each of these parts. Okay, each of these parts in analysis I'm not showing here, but is in the paper, are orthogonal, right? They're these multidimensional, in this case, two or three-dimensional subspaces. They're all orthogonal to each other. And within each of them, you have the beliefs for each of the parts. You can look at how this looks over training. You can see kind of the parts emerge over training in kind of this stepwise fashion that we think, we're still doing experiments about this, that kind of respects the way that they interact. It's pretty cool. Yeah?
And just speaking about linear representations that look like this, do you mean they literally, like, if you just take and project it and look at it, it looks like this, or they can be mapped to a representation?
So we do, in this case, we do linear regression. But given that, and stuff that wasn't in the paper, if you do something like ICA on the activations, you also get something that looks like this, if that makes sense. And of course, like building an unsupervised method that would find these things without knowing the ground truth is like something we're very much excited about. Okay, but what happens in the general case? Like, data is not going to perfectly have latent structure that factorizes, obviously. That's like kind of a crazy thing to expect. So what happens if you're off this manifold? To study this, what we do is we kind of have, we take the previous experimental setup, but now we add a noisy map from these kind of subtokens to these, such that like usually this 0, 1, 0, 1, 2 would map to, let's say, 54. And we're going to have some epsilon probability that you just randomly replace that 54 with another token. And what that does is that induces correlations in all of the subparts such that they're no longer conditionally independent. And you kind of, your beliefs go off of that product state, off of that manifold, submanifold into the joint space, into that much higher dimensional joint space. We can tune the noise. So in this right-hand plot, the noise of 0.5 means that in 50% of the tokens generated, they're like literally uniformly taken out. So it's like highly non-factorizable in that case. But we can tune that. And what we find is when we look at the dimensionality that it's still early in training does collapse to the factored representation. And it kind of has a plateau there. And it will, importantly, this is on a log scale. It will have a plateau at this factored representation. We'll only go off of it with sustained gradient pressure, eventually kind of going into the joint representation space. So this is kind of evidence, as far as we're concerned, that transformers really do have kind of a native bias to factor these things, even when like the process doesn't strictly admit a factorization. Okay, so the general picture we have is that we started with belief states over a discrete set of latent states, and we already kind of got non-trivial fractal geometries from that. And then we saw that when we generalized that picture to belief states over a continuum of latent states, we got even more interesting geometries that have to do with these generalized probabilistic theories. And then we included structure that was kind of factorization of these belief geometries, and that gave us multidimensional components in the activations arranged orthogonal to each other in a certain way. And we think that this factorization of belief geometries is really a guiding stars for the types of things we might find in LLMs. And that is, of course, big if true. But does any of this exist in real models? So what I'll show here is just like very early work in that direction. We are now like a large part of our team increasingly is like focused on kind of scaling this up to real models. We have like a set of work that has to do with pushing the theory into more complicated regimes, and then another set of work that really has to do with kind of trying to push this into real models at scale. Very preliminary initial work. This was just kind of looking at Gemascope SAEs and then clustering the SAE latents by coactivation, and then trying to just look through and finding clusters of SAE latents that coactivate and that are interpretable. And here's one example. So this is 3 SAE latents whose activations seem to form this triangular looking thing. And they all fire on the word between. And you really have to dig deep into the details to figure out what the hell is going on. Like, you might just naively be like, oh, it's feature splitting with between. But actually what's going on is that the corners of this triangle correlate to slightly different definitions of the word between. So On the top, you have kind of a collective definition. So like a peace treaty was signed between Prussia and Denmark. In this bottom left, you tend to get words that have to do with comparative. So like in our view, the disparity between the compensatory damages and the punitive damages, et cetera. And then on the bottom right is positional, which is like between dates or places in space. Importantly, the word between, when it comes up in a sentence, like if you have but between, you don't know what definition it is. So it makes sense that you might want to keep track of the definition in a space like this. Again, this is just like, this is not like knockdown proof that our theory is playing out in LLMs, but it is consistent. Of course, what we want to do kind of in the applied side of things is to make an unsupervised tool that respects the theoretical considerations we've figured out and the ones that we're still yet to figure out and works at scale. So how can we do that? Well, that'll be for the next time I come. There's a few things I didn't talk about. There's a lot of things I didn't talk about, but a few of them are kind of relating our theory to in context dynamics and training data structure, which shows that when you have what you can think of as non-ergodic structure. So this is like when your data comes from multiple sources, right? So some data comes from Wikipedia, and some data comes from code bases. And those are kind of distinct data generators. And your data is not, in general, a mix of them. It's like one or the other. And similar to how a factored structure gives rise to a certain geometric implication, so does this kind of non-ergodicity. But it also has implications for the dynamics in context. So there's some work on that. And then, like I said before, most of our theory work does not really take into account the specific structures of transformers. It's model agnostic, which in some sense is nice, but also is like, okay, but these transformers do have a certain particular mathematical form. So how does that interplay? And so in this work, we kind of constrained the theory that we had with the mathematical form of attention. And in doing so, when we trained on our synthetic data sources, we were able to make precise predictions about the geometry of the embedding, the activations after the attention and after the MLP, all of the attention head patterns over all of the inputs. So we really had like a full, complete understanding of every part of the transformer, relating kind of our theory to the structural form of the transformer. So there's a lot of work to do. We're currently hiring in both the Bay Area and London. And if you want more information about that, you can talk to me. But also you could visit our website. And I'm happy to take questions.
So for the piece at the beginning where you have like the belief state geometry diagrams, how like can you create a model that does well at the prediction task that does not have that, or somehow doing well just means having that?
Right, that's a great question. So in general, you can. So actually, someone did this at a hackathon that we ran a few years back, where they said, I don't know anything about computational mechanics, I don't know anything about this theory, but I know if you give me some simple data, I can hand code the weights of a model that solves it. And so they did this. They literally just like pen and paper were like, this is what the MLP should be, this is what the attention weight should be, which I thought was very impressive and cool. But then they looked at the actual representations inside, and it did not give you the geometry. And at first, we were like, oh, this is bad for a theory. But then, actually, I think after a bunch of thinking about it and playing around, the story is that the solution that you come up with kind of by hand, where you just like put in the features that intuitively make sense for you to solve the prediction task, that actually is, it turns out, even in that case, was an encoding for the belief states. In other words, it said, it made distinctions between all the belief states, but it didn't respect the geometry of our predictions. And because of that, there's more work to do to like concretize this, but pretty sure what's going on is that you could notice in that if you change the weights a little in that solution, you would just do terribly on the task. So it was like highly not robust. So there's something about the embedding into this belief geometry, into the space where close points in activation space correspond to similar predictions about the future. That means that if you are a little bit off, you'll do okay. But if you don't respect that structure, you actually, gradient descent probably can't get there robustly. And if you do get there, if you like kind of have a little bit of noise in your representations, you'll just like completely fail at the prediction task. So what the theory kind of strictly says is that you need to represent the information of the states of the beliefs. It doesn't say with this geometry. There's just a natural geometry, and we happen to find that that is what we find in actual transformers. And we have this explanation, which has to do with the fact that this gives you kind of a naturally robust solution, where if you have noise in your representations, you still do pretty okay.
Yeah, thanks. Also, one quick clarification about the diagram. Are the colors just redundant with the position?
Yeah, so the reason we do that, though, is because so we color in the experimental results plot with the colors from the ground truth. So in other words, it is possible, although unlikely probably, that right, you can get kind of a fractal structure, but you haven't actually kept the correspondence between the specific contexts that induce that belief and the point. So it's possible, in other words, to get this fractally looking thing, but have all the colors jumbled up. So we color the experimental results with the ground truth geometry, yeah. So we're just trying to give each point here a unique color.
I see, thanks.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about what type of models you're using? And in particular, have you looked at any like reasoning models and how the geometry might change over very long contexts?
Yeah, so everything I showed today was in like small models. I mean, they have layer norm. They're, I don't know, between 1 and 8 layers-ish. Small context window, like max like 100. As far as we can tell, like on these small toy synthetic things, kind of the results are independent of those concerns. We do have projects going on right now looking at how post-training of different types that can either be through kind of chain of thought reasoning, kind of RL-ish post-training, or even supervised fine-tuning change the representations. Yeah, and that's ongoing work. It's all cool. Yeah.
Thanks for your
actually, Karthik is doing it. That's right. No, it's okay.
Okay. I have 2 questions. One is very mechanical, and the other's a bit more complicated. One was just you showed doing these structure plots from Gemascope and the SAEs. So I understanding like those were PCAs on just the concatenation of the full like SAE vector, or was this some extra processing here?
That was first choosing 3 SAE latents.
Okay.
So you could think of that as 3 directions in the residual stream by the coactivation of them over a large data set. And then it was just kind of running PCA on the activations over those 3 directions.
Okay.
You could have plotted it in 2. So if you plotted in 3D, you didn't need to do PCA. If you plotted in the like true 3D space, you would still see a 2D plane with a triangle.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the second question, sorry, I walked in late and was only listening to audio earlier,
Yep.
so sorry if this is bad, but I think you mentioned at one point that this applies for any thing that's generating tokens. I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on like denoising kind of approaches, you know, going back from like BERT-like models to now the theoretical diffusion type models. And are these likely, do the same theories apply? Are the structures very different or essentially the same?
So one kind of nuanced clarification, but so the theory is really about things that predict token sequences, not generate. Although, like one of the points of this is that that distinction actually matters. Now, everything I said was really about the prediction task that had kind of a causal masking type of structure where you're kind of looking at past and you're trying to predict futures. But you can kind of step back into the earlier parts of the theory and you can change that. And you could just say like, imagine that I have the future and I have the past, but I don't have the current. you can ask the question, what is the optimal belief? What are the beliefs that I need to do that task? It'll be different in general than what we showed, but it's still doable completely within the theory. And what's the geometric? We have not done that work. We've talked about it a lot. This is one of the reasons why we're scaling our team, exactly to do this kind of thing. You can also do that with diffusion type models where you kind of have a more random masking.
Can you, suppose you have like tiny stories or some data set like that, can you talk about what some of the factorizations would be? Like, would it be like you can expect for there to be one for like gender, or maybe for like part of speech, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those things at the moment are just intuitions. I think there's kind of two ways we're going to go about it. So one way is to, given kind of what we know, is to try to intuit what they could or might or should be, and then try to find whether or not that's actually true with that lens of understanding the internal structure. And exactly the types of things you said are the types of things we would look for. And then the other way, of course, is to kind of go in the opposite direction and be like, okay, given that these types of factored structures occur, how can we build ever more slightly complicated synthetic data sets that kind of respect the structure but get closer to certain types of structure in natural language, and then see what happens even just in toy models. One thing that's very nice about that is that we can then, in those cases, we have ground truth. We know exactly what should be kind of the representation. And so anytime we make a new unsupervised tool, we can actually benchmark it against this ground truth. And we can make those ground truths like have different types of structure and all that stuff. I mean, one thing with SAEs that's been difficult is that it's hard to know when you do well, right? At the end, you get like something like reconstruction loss, but that's not really your end goal. Your end goal is not reconstruction loss. So yeah, I think we don't know the answer to that. We can guess things, but really it's going to be kind of a mix of empirics and theoretical thing that's going to unlock it. Yeah.
And I guess just like along those lines, why would you expect it to be like he versus she instead of just like is he, or like is she? I don't know if this makes any sense, but like,
are you saying why probabilistic rather than discrete?
Or is there some like sweet spot of like this factorization has like enough complexity to be useful versus just being some like obvious thing?
I think the one thing to bring up is that I mean we talked about at most like 5 different parts, but like in general, the factors are not only going to be like many more parts. They're also going to have hierarchical structure. Some of them will be kind of hidden and implicit, and others won't be, in the sense that like some will contribute directly to the token output in the way that these did, but some won't. And even in cases where it's just like, it's obvious if it's he or she, like let's say that's always the case, although I don't think it is, but let's say it is. Even in those cases, given the kind of multiplicity of how it interacts with all the other things there, you actually do end up getting like just crazy dimensional savings by kind of always factoring things out. The more kind of discrete things are, the more it's at least intuitive to me that the transformer could play tricks that don't like exactly conform to the kind of theoretical understanding we have right now. But part of the whole research program is to like figure out exactly the edges of the theory and when it does apply and when it doesn't. Yeah, but to do so in like kind of a rigorous way that we can track.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what you sort of like the connection between like the factored representations and something like SAEs, where like it seems like a really like extreme version of like a factorization could just be like, oh, you have like 5 belief states, each one of these gets a vector,
right,
or like a dimension of the vector space.
So I mean, maybe one illustrative example is just to like think through what would happen if you trained an SAE on even the like 5 factored processes that we did here. Basically, I mean, this all depends on the details of your SAE, obviously. But the general story is going to be something like, basically, the latents of the SAE will not respect the factorization structure because they're just trying to get the most variance, right? They're not trying to pull out independent structure, which is why something like, even in this case, is ICA works better than PCA. And like SAEs are like kind of PCA plus some tricks, if you want to think about it like that. And so you really do need kind of a different unsupervised tool if you want to kind of respect these structures. There is kind of like a hope, like, you know, we did this like kind of like, we're like, well, let's just use SAEs and see what comes out kind of approach. Right, there is like kind of a hope, and people have seen it, right? You look at a bunch of different SAE latents and you look at the structure of activations and you see like more complicated geometric structures. It's interesting to me that even though like kind of, it feels like many people are on board with like, yeah, of course there's going to be this kind of activation geometry that's non-trivial. But then like you go to look for them and like, it's actually not that easy to find them, right? Like, you know, what do we have? We have like days of the week and, you know, a few others. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that it's hard to find if you're not kind of looking for it in the right way, if that makes sense. And again, if you were to use just kind of like a normal SAE approach, even in these super simple cases, you will not be able to pull apart the independent factors. Like even if you kind of take arbitrary sets of them, because everything will be mixed together in those, because they're just trying to get variance, not independent structure. So the trick is really to like kind of, as much as possible, try to respect kind of the structure of the task we were asking these LLMs to do, at least during pre-training for the moment. And then kind of given that, right, the idea isn't to like vindicate some theory. Like already, like factorization and to some extent even these like generalized probabilistic theories was not part of the original theory of computational mechanics. Like this is already beyond that. The point is really to try to push on the theory as much as possible and break it such that we are more and more precisely capturing the like native structure of these LLMs given the tasks that they have, and then build tools that respect that. Yeah. So
it seems to me that a lot of the interpretability work when it moves to language models is operating at like a very fine-grained word or token level. And like the example you gave with between is one such instance.
Yep.
And it seems like what we want at the end of the day is a much higher level thing of like, is this close to the malicious persona or something? Or like, are we far from being jailbroken? Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like how do you envision this crossing that gap?
Totally. I've been very inspired by the recent persona work, actually. And I think it's something that we want to move towards more and more. Just as an example. So like one way we might think about that, like a very natural framing of the persona work from this point of view is that, you know, everything is about kind of conditional independent structure. And when you do assistant colon, that is kind of a signal of a certain conditional independent structure. Conditioned on assistant colon, you get a certain structure in your internals. And there will be factors that are shared kind of between the assistant and the user kind of structures. And right, we can make synthetic settings where you have kind of different components that share certain structures, but not all structures. And what are the implications there? What would it even mean to kind of stay within a persona versus not? But exactly like you were saying, the thing to do there is to really kind of recognize that the representations in the model, it's not respecting the actual problem that they have to deal with and how they structure their internal representations to be like, where does assistant colon land? Like the thing that's getting embedded is the whole history of the conversation. And of course, like assistant colon does a certain thing. It conditions in a very particular way, but it's definitely not the whole story. So that probably didn't answer your question super well, but it's like maybe a little bit of an idea of where we can go. So we can, on the one hand, again, there's always going to be this kind of like LLMs looking down and theory kind of looking up, where at the theory side, we can kind of push on the complexity and the structures inherent in these data generators, and we want them to be inspired by kind of phenomenon like personas. So building toy models of personas and stuff like that. And on the other hand, like kind of going to the LLM, using the intuitions that our theory kind of gives us and trying to find more lawful representations there. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Adam, for coming.
Thank you all.